Well, hello everybody. Welcome to our webinar session today. We're going to be talking about some tips that we'd like to give you around the topic of IBM access management. We all have profiles that we've got to deal with. We want to make sure that they're being done correctly, and this is certainly a conversation that I have often when I'm out on the road and visiting with customers, and some of the pain points that they have around this. So we thought this would be some fun content for us to share with you. It's my pleasure to be joined by Sandy Moore, whose voice you were just hearing. But Sandy, go ahead and say hi to everybody here, and then we'll start talking about our message.
Hi guys, Sandy Moore here, security consultant with Help Systems. Thank you, Robin. Glad to be here.
Yeah, very welcome. And I always love doing these with you, Sandy, because you have so much insight into what folks are doing and not doing around IBM security. And obviously a big piece of that is around the creation and management of profiles. So we definitely want to share that with people today. In fact, we're going to really start with that. We want to kind of set some baseline here around why we need to have a conversation pertaining to IBM user profiles. And really some of that really stems from the fact that, certainly, of course, we talk about customers and other entities being a valuable asset, but ultimately the people that are managing or running our applications, typing in our data, making business decisions, these people are, of course, potentially the greatest asset that we have around our business process, but they also have the potential of being our greatest liability, which is an ironic kind of twist here, because when it comes to access to the database and when it comes to people's capabilities within the system and server environment, obviously, if a user has too many privileges, then there is potential that they could do things, whether it be malicious or more likely accidental, that would be detrimental to what we do with our business data. So we're going to focus kind of on the threat of insider problems here. Again, not always necessarily a malicious act. That's one type of insider threat that we encounter, but more often than not, it's accidental, or it could, of course, be negligence, where people are just really either not paying attention or they're doing things that it's about cutting corners or saving time and really not giving it the right amount of attention that it needs. So typically insider threats fall into one of these three categories, but I think we're all guilty oftentimes when we hear the term insider threat that we're immediately assuming that it was some type of criminal or malicious act. And based on the calls that I have and the customers that we meet with, most of the activity that we see actually typically falls in one of the other categories. Now, this is an important part of a conversation about security in general, because when we look at the types of data breaches that occur, what we see is often misconfiguration is a leading component to the causes of these data breaches. If you've not seen this chart before, I think it's very valuable. It's actually maintained by the X-Force team within IBM, which, other than being a really cool name for a security team, actually gives us a lot of insight based on the color of the circles here and also the size of the circles, which tells us the size of the breach that occurred or the attack that occurred. Now, what we're seeing is a pretty significant share of these types of attacks can be attributed either to misconfiguration or to undisclosed. And I would offer that undisclosed probably has a significant portion of it attributed to misconfiguration. So when we look at that as a color trend, then I think that we have to recognize that oftentimes simply setting up the server incorrectly, and that includes the profiles that we're setting up, is a major component when it comes to the risks of being attacked and how we see those exploited. When we look at the statistics from organizations like privacyrights.org, we can filter down and see how many records have been breached due to an insider. And in this case, I checked this fairly recently, and it was currently at 83 million records that were attributed to some form of insider incident. One of the pain points here, one of the scary aspects to insider breaches is that they tend to take a lot of effort to discover. As you can imagine, having a user who is legitimately accessing an application, but perhaps bending or pushing the envelope of what they should be doing on the system makes it much more difficult than if somebody is potentially coming from outside or they're representing themselves in a way that is different from the role that they fulfill. So the detection period tends to be a lot longer. The costs associated with that are fairly well defined as well. Verito has indicated that the median loss of an insider breach falls somewhere around 4 million US dollars, and about half of those victims never recovered any of those losses. The thing I always remind people of as well is while we focus potentially on outsiders and insiders, when somebody does come in from the outside, eventually they're going to make a connection to the server using most likely a set of credentials that exist on the system. So when we talk about insiders, we also have to acknowledge that there is potential that the person who is connecting using that user ID and password may or may not be the person that that set of credentials was issued to. And so limiting what a user can do on the system to a scope that is more associated with the role that they perform is going to ultimately be very beneficial in reducing the risk that somebody is potentially masquerading as somebody they are not. Now, one of my responsibilities at Health Systems is to help put together the State of IBM Security study, which we just released for 2019 not too long ago. And Sandy, I know you are one of the folks that helps perform the security scans that contributes data into this study. And so I thought it would be valuable for us to have just a gentle introduction into some of the statistics around user profiles, because that is obviously pivotal to our discussion today, so that again we can kind of lay out some groundwork here with regards to how big of an entity or a problem this potentially is. So for 2019, we analyzed almost 300,000 user profiles. That was quite a task. There's a lot of parameters on the user profiles, and we try to look through all of the key indicators in order to understand how these are impacting our security and risk stance. Some of the stats that we pulled were that a fourth of all the servers that we looked at had a profile that existed on that server that it had experienced more than 1,000 invalid sign-on attempts against it. So that's 25% of every system had at least one profile with more than 1,000 attempts, and that's a pretty staggering number. Now, there were 10 systems that had experienced over 10,000 attempts. So this is really a clear indication that whether it's a legitimate application that is, quote unquote, broken, or a brute force attack, or whatever it may be, that these profiles are being subjected to some form of connection inquiry that in this case is failing. And that's definitely something that we want to be concerned with, because if it were to succeed, then of course that user is now on the system and potentially able to access data. Now, the strength of those passwords is extremely relevant. What we tend to see now is that best practices are kind of pushing us to around the 8 boundary, if not higher, but the vast majority of systems that we see in an IBM conversation fall much short, or far short of that. In some instances, and as you can see on the left-hand side there, very far short. 16 systems had a minimum password length of 1. In fact, I was actually on a call this morning and had another system that fell into that bucket, which is quite alarming when it really is one of the key markers of the strength of your security. So take a look. This is measured by a system value called QPassword minimum length. You can also designate it as one of the rules in the QPassword rules system value. But take a look and make sure you clearly understand what users are being subjected to when it comes to minimum and maximum lengths and other rules pertaining to passwords, because ultimately this is one of the most important elements to ensure that a user is only able to connect when they have the relevant data. Now, one of the systems we had over 12,000 profiles with a password that mirrored the name of the profile. So my user ID is Robin and my password is Robin. So this particular system had over 12,000 profiles that fell into that category. The average, however, granted, being skewed a little bit by this number, is over 180 profiles per system. So this is a very easy way for somebody to abuse a system simply by guessing or brute forcing their way through the credentials. Dormant accounts are another area that we see as being somewhat problematic. We have a tendency in the IBMI community to allow a user to become dormant, the profile no longer perhaps necessary, but we don't always act upon that. And that may be a matter of leaving it enabled. It may be a matter of perhaps disabling it, but leaving it on the system. All of these things potentially represent risk, and we need to talk about the best way to manage that to ensure that we don't leave the door open to accounts that no longer need to be there. One of the things that I do for customers is have conversation around privileged accounts, because of course, in an IBMI sense, any privileged account has the potential of accessing the database through a number of different mechanisms, not just the traditional green screen. Regulations speak to the idea that we need to accept the fact that there will be some privileged accounts necessary, but that the average user should not be one of them. So one of the first things we need to do is understand what is the definition of a powerful user. And this is one that I put together and I tend to leverage because I think it's fairly representative of how most of us consider privileges to be assigned. First of all, it could be somebody that has one or more of the 8 special authorities that exist on the system. It could also be somebody who has private authority to individual database objects or applications. And it could also be somebody who's operating on a server that has very permissive public authority. If you're not familiar with the concept of public permissions, don't worry too much. Just think of it as a default authority that is granted to users. And if that happens to be open, that means then by having a user ID and password, by default, you're going to have access to things. And I've given you the hint here because the state of security tells us that most systems have very permissive public authority. The most common public permission is star change, and that is enough to allow a user to change, read, and even delete data in a file, and to run an application, which, let's face it, what more does a user really need to do other than those things? So a powerful user needs to be considered not necessarily as the role the user was hired into, but more around the privileges that their profile is carrying. Now, having one or more of those bullets satisfied doesn't necessarily equate to the risk that that user provides, because they also tend to need a way to execute commands. That does not necessarily mean green screen command line permission, if you're familiar with the limit capabilities attribute, because there are other ways to run commands on the system that don't always honor those restrictions. The other possibility is a tool that provides direct access to the database. Maybe it's Microsoft Excel or Crystal Reports or something that is perhaps PC based that is running over an ODBC or a JDBC connection. All of these things add up to the premise that a user could be powerful. So the question I tend to ask people is, how many powerful users do you have? Again, and if we think of this in the context of the privileges they have versus just limiting it to somebody who is in that justified role, what we tend to see is a lot of these privileges being granted in levels that really we struggle to justify. Starting on the left-hand side, we have all object, which in essence is the keys to the kingdom. In the 2019 State of IBMI Security Study, we saw an average of 168 of these on each system. As we move across the bars, spool control, job control, almost 500 apiece there. Now, if you're not familiar with the nuances of each of these privileges, that's okay. But what I want you to understand, if nothing else, is these are called special authorities because they're special. There's a reason they're given that title. And administrators often have justified reason for carrying these privileges, and end user really should not need any of them. Now, job control, for example, allows a user potentially to bring the system down into a restricted state. Save sys on the far right is a permission that allows a user to save any object on the machine, which, arguably sounds pretty innocent, especially if you're an operator type person. But first of all, I would offer it's unlikely you have over 200 operators. Second of all, when you save an object, what you're actually doing is creating a duplicate copy of it on media. And if you can then access that media from another system, or perhaps restore the object from the media to, let's say, a work library, there's potential now that you can perform actions on the duplicate copy that you would not normally be authorized to perform on the original, including downloading, modifying, or even deleting. Now, the other thing with save sys is that there's some parameters on the save commands that allow you to clear the database after the save is complete. So don't think of these authorities as things that really have any justification down at the user level. And yet we're granting these privileges to people simply because they've always had it, and we're not sure what will happen when we take it away. My suggestion to you is inventory who your profiles are so that you can understand if there's business reason behind this, or if it is simply a statement of this is the way it's always been. I mentioned command line permissions, and the number of users that have the ability to run commands on the command line, again, usually far exceeds the number of profiles that should. To me, the assignment of unlimited capabilities really should be restricted to programmers and admins and not be granted to end users. And 346 admins is unlikely. So we want to make sure that, again, that's a control that is easily leveraged in order to place some restrictions over our general user community. So here's 5 things that, I think we've learned along the way as we look at now, over 30 years of experience on the AS400 iSeries and now IBM I platform. First of all, we tend to see that profiles are not created from scratch. They're duplicated or copied from somebody that we perceive to be in a similar role. Unfortunately, though, after that duplication occurs, we don't tend to circle back around and say, are there any customizations that have been put in place here that perhaps we should review? So the duplicate copy is perhaps tweaked, and then that copy is used as the template for the next copy. And what we end up with is no clear consistency between our profiles. We also know that these profiles tend to need tighter configuration in order to meet regulatory demands. Most regulations that are built on a framework like NIST require good configuration, the right password strength at the system level, the right assignment of those special authorities that we just looked at. And what we tend to see is that this is pretty loose and prevalent in an IBM I world. What we want to do is leverage a much more consistent onboarding process. When we provision a new user account, rather than just simply say, hey, I need a new account, let me try to find somebody who's similar, it should be clearly delineated the template that's being used, the process, and the review mechanism to ensure that when that profile is created, it is carrying all of the authorities it needs and none that it shouldn't, okay? Most of us do this manually. That tends to be a fairly error-prone function. We create users on a one-by-one basis. If we have multiple LPARs, we go out to each of them individually and we provision them there. And or we save and restore, or again, we copy and we get a significant amount of inconsistency when we do that. What we'd much rather see is that the controls be better established and the users that we create, especially those with some form of privilege on the system, are closely audited so that we have a breadcrumb trail of where they went and what they use those authorities for. So let's kind of take a look at putting the user on the system. Now that we know the traditional view of IBM I is that we have a little bit of work to do here, to say the least, let's understand some of the things that we should be doing when it comes to onboarding a new user. One of the tips from me is that we should define user roles. Again, what we're thinking of here is more the context of the responsibility that the user has, whether they're perhaps part of the accounting department, whether they are an application developer, they're part of order entry. Breaking these roles down will allow us to have then similarities across our user community. We can then define the associated security settings that align with those roles. And that's really the next step there, is those authority requirements. How much permission do you need if you are in order entry? Well, presumably you need access to the order entry application, but probably not to the payroll application, right? So by defining those roles, it makes it much easier and clearer for us to then define the authority levels. Once we do that, we can build templates. And that may be as simple as creating a dummy profile that has the associated authority attributes and privileges that would be carried by that role. That allows us then to create or onboard a new account based on a fixed template rather than quote unquote somebody you think is similar. There is an option as well, instead of creating these people manually, is that perhaps we trigger that provisioning process based on another provisioning process that you're probably already performing within IT. And that's often around Active Directory. You create the user account within Windows. Let's see if we can actually then trigger the appropriate creations of the profiles in an IBM iSense.
So Robin, I'm thinking that maybe that users can make this process easier for themselves. Can you tell us a little bit about PowerTech Identity Manager and how that can help leverage the deployment of these profiles?
Absolutely. So really, again, just addressing the bullet points on the slide here, one of the biggest value adds that we can bring to the table is the ability to manage this from a central role environment, a kind of a central pane of glass. And the Identity Manager tool in our portfolio facilitates that. First of all, we have hooks into Active Directory, so we can establish these roles and then have them triggered by the addition of the user into AD. But even if you're not doing that, if you just simply want to manage your IBMI profiles, doing so from one partition, whereby you can say, Sandy, you're a developer in the organization, which means you should be on LPAR 1, 3, and 5. And when I create your profile, it's going to be consistent across those partitions. And I know those 3 profiles are tied to you as a person, as an individual. Then it becomes a lot more streamlined, but a lot more consistent. And that way we get away from having all of this mishmash of different settings on different profiles. The attributes on the profile, of course, are extremely important as well. A strong password policy is incredibly important. Now, one thing that I do tend to see is some of the weaknesses, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, are really happening at the hands of the administrative team. Now, it's good from the standpoint of knowing that an end user can't do things like setting a default password. The system blocks it. But as an administrator, considered by the SecAdmin special authority privilege, the operating system doesn't typically enforce the security policy for those users. So even though our password minimum length is, say, 10 characters, an administrator can create a user profile that has a password of the letter A. Now, there are some things we can do about that in later versions of the operating system. If you are at version 7.2 or later, there is an attribute that you can specify in the password rules system value that indicates that even administrators have to abide by the password policy. Now, I mentioned earlier that the best practices and frameworks like NIST are kind of pushing us towards longer and longer passwords. We're almost considering passphrases at this point, which kind of tends to scare people. We are simple folk in the IBMI world, and the idea of a 14 or 16 character password, especially assigning that to our end users, is a scary thought. And that's really because we know how much our users tend to struggle with remembering even simple passwords. But what I offer to people is, if you can get over the kind of political hurdle of doing that, users tend to enjoy it more because the passwords can be less complex, less hard to remember, and therefore they're less likely to write them down and get frustrated. So if I can use a string of words that are familiar to me, it's actually easier to remember those types of longer passwords than it is even the shorter ones. We also want to make sure that we're assigning only special authorities to those users that need them. And that's a break or a change from what we traditionally tend to do. Again, part of that stems back to the legacy or history of some of the applications whereby the user had these authorities and may or may not have had justification for it back in the day. But as we migrate those profiles from system to system, we really have not ever turned around and addressed that shortcoming. The bottom line is only administrators should have administrative privileges, and that's definitely something that needs some focus and attention. I've also mentioned the limit capabilities setting. This is often interpreted as the command line permission. Now, there are other things that command line in addition to command line permission, that limit capabilities really kind of influences, but command line is certainly the biggest one. For me, an end user really does not need unlimited capabilities. So this is an easy way, low-hanging fruit item that allows us to corral the user a little bit and potentially prevent them from leveraging those special authorities that you have not yet cleaned up. The initial program and initial menu is also kind of an important combination. Many of us use the initial menu star sign-off setting in order to indicate that the profile is perhaps a service account or a profile that goes into an application that if they try to exit the application should not take them to the main menu, it should actually sign them off. But what they don't realize is that the initial menu is sometimes override or can be overridden by the user themselves. For example, if a user does not have limited capabilities and you have the initial plain IBM supplied sign-on screen, you can type the name of the initial menu right on the sign-on screen and it will override any administrative assigned menu, including star sign-off, and take the user to a place on the system that you may not be expecting. So all of these attributes need to be clearly understood. They need to be part of the user policy. And when we provision a new user, we need to ensure that we are setting these values up correctly.
So that's a lot of things to keep track of and a lot of attributes that you need to be cognizant of. So we've got a couple tools that maybe you can talk about that are going to help people be able to corral these users and their attributes on their profiles.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've really got two sides of this conversation, right? One is when we create new user profiles, and we've talked a little bit about Identity Manager and ensuring that our new accounts are created cleanly. But let's face it, most of us have a lot of profiles on the system already, and there's a couple of ways that we can work to address that. The first one is Compliance Monitor, which allows us as part of an entire suite of reports to be able to identify what type of attributes are being given to our profiles. So we can, for example, run a report that identifies any profile that has command line permission, initial menu star sign off, and maybe has all object. So we can slice and dice that data any which way we want to in order to give us a firm understanding of how our profiles are set up so that we can determine, do we need any remediation steps? And if so, what those would be. The other tool, and one of my favorites, is called Policy Manager, which allows us to define a baseline of how our system should look in many different areas of configuration, not least of which profiles, in order to then have an ongoing review of that so that I can determine exceptions. So one of the pain points I hear from people is, hey, we've got 1,000 profiles. I'm not going to go look at them every day to see if a user's been granted a special authority that they shouldn't have. So what we can do here is simply build a policy that says these are the 7 profiles that should have all object, and then run an exception report. And if we come up with another 993 of them on the report, we know we've got some cleanup to do. And Policy Manager not only will identify the exceptions, it can remediate them as well. So now we transition from being reactive to extremely proactive, and we can identify and remediate within one tool. So both of these, I think, have a lot of value in this particular area of configuration, and definitely something that I would suggest you take a look at. Now, one area that is very problematic when it comes to IBMI profiles is arguably one of the best attributes of IBMI, and that's its forwards compatibility. There is no other technology out there where I can unload an application that was written in 1988 and load it in 2019 and have it run not only untouched, but run with the full capabilities of the new hardware that I've loaded it on. Now, that's great from an administrative perspective. If you're the guy doing the upgrade on the weekend, then that's extremely helpful. And we've all used that and relied on that for 3 decades now. But when it comes to user profiles and configuration, it also has a downside in that it means that we are propagating configurations that were architected in a world that is very different from the one we live in today, all the way back perhaps even to before the internet was a thing and before networks were really out there. So our user profile configurations, which were easily constrained by something as simple as a menu, now become problematic because that same profile can connect to the system from the other side of the world. Again, templates are beneficial here, but we have to acknowledge that we have a lot of existing profiles that should be cleaned up, but those concepts of roles and templates will really help us here. So this is kind of an extension of the last discussion. We want to make sure that those templates not only are managing the new profiles being created, but they're handling the ones that were already out there. And the other bullet is to make sure that if we have profiles that are no longer needed, that they don't just sit out there ad infinitum, we actually do something about them. In Sandy here, we really kind of have the same recommendation from a tooling perspective, because really the problem is the same regardless of whether you're dealing with a new profile or whether an existing one.
Absolutely.
Another area that I'm recommending is to consider eliminating passwords altogether, right? We all know they're frustrating. I'm an IT guy, I'm in IT security, and I hate passwords as much as everybody else, maybe for slightly different reasons. My frustration is largely targeted at the fact that we don't tend to implement good security policy around passwords, so they tend to be the Achilles heel of my security infrastructure, right? Now, IBMI itself includes single sign-on functionality, and this is something that was of great interest to people, I'm going to say about 10 years ago, and then it went kind of dormant. People got away from wanting to do it. But over the last year or two, we've seen a significant resurgence in the people that are interested in implementing single sign-on, not only at their infrastructure level and at their enterprise level, but also to include IBMI. And it's great because the operating system does has this functionality. And that allows us to, in essence, eliminate the reliance on users setting up good passwords. Now, we still want good password policy in place because along the way, there's going to be IBM accounts and other service accounts that you're probably not going to use with single sign-on. So it doesn't give us complete freedom to just abandon all good things around passwords, but we recognize that it eliminates a lot of the frustration to the end users.
So we've got things that can help. We can help with that as well. I guess, of course, that's not going to be an easy process. So tell us a little bit about what we offer here.
Well, it's quite simple in concept because IBMI includes single sign-on functionality. It's just a matter of setting it up. Now, setting it up is sometimes easier than it sounds. So we have people that are trained in this. Pat Boats is on staff, and his team is responsible for helping customers configure their single sign-on environment, and then also potentially doing some of the legwork of setting users up. So while the operating system includes the functionality, knowing how to do it and do it correctly is probably one of the reasons that this fell off the radar of a lot of people, originally when we started talking about this. So now that people are reinterested, what I suggest is that you leverage people that have done this many, many times before rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. So this is an area where not necessarily through software because the OS already does it, but through knowledge and configuration help, we can absolutely bring assistance to the table here. What about password verification? If we're going to stick with passwords, then one of the things that we should be able to do is validate that the person using the credentials is the person that was assigned the credentials. Now, this tends to be called two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. If you're not familiar with that term, you're probably familiar with the concept. And the reason I put an ATM keypad up here is because that is probably the most popular deployment of multi-factor authentication. And it simply breaks down to the idea that passwords alone are something that you know and therefore could be disclosed, be it deliberately or accidentally. Maybe you write it on a Post-it note, maybe you lose the notebook that had it written down, or maybe somebody just asks you what your password is. We always want it to be secret, but we all know that there are dictionaries out there based on data breaches that have occurred that in essence have just hundreds of thousands, millions even, of these passwords stored away ready to be used in a brute force attack. Now, the idea behind the multi-factor authentication in the case of the ATM machine is not only do we have our 4-digit PIN in our heads, but we also have a card in our purse or our wallet. And if you don't have both of those together, then one alone is not sufficient to get you in. I could find a card on the street, but there's little likelihood that I'm going to be able to use it in an ATM machine. Likewise, I could tell you my 4-digit ATM code, but without the physical card in your possession, the number itself doesn't do anything. So by combining these, it's extremely valuable and allows the system to authenticate and validate that the user is who they're claiming to be.
So it sounds like the users can benefit from the PowerTech multi-factor authentication for IBMI. How do you see that working out?
Yep, so that's a great addition to our portfolio, and it allows us to, in essence, intercept the IBMI login and send additional verification requests to the user. And there's different ways we can do that, ranging from a Windows client to probably the most popular one, which is communicating with the user's mobile device. So perhaps there's a request that goes to a cell phone. That can include biometrics. So if you have Face ID or fingerprint scanner on your phone, then when we receive that request, you simply satisfy that biometric scan, and the system then is informed that you have validated that you are who in fact you're claiming to be, and the sign-on will complete. So it's very beneficial, but it's very streamlined. So the end user, who is becoming more and more familiar with this type of technology, if they do anything on the internet, can now do this at an enterprise level and make sure that we're able to validate that user IDs for IBMI are being used appropriately. All right, so once we've onboarded the user, we have to talk, of course, about the ongoing maintenance of those. So for me, one of the first steps is to ensure that we audit anytime a profile is created or removed. Now, in order to do that, I've given you just a couple of notes up here. There are a couple of system values that predominantly control whether auditing is active and the types of events that are being audited. Now, we want to make sure, once it's turned on, that we're including security events. Pretty much end of story. But out of that security event, we want to be looking specifically here for CP events. So security should always be there, but I'm suggesting that CP events are going to indicate when a profile has been created or modified, and that's something that you should know is happening on your system, especially if you don't tend to see a lot of those type of activities. Now, deletion events are different. If you're auditing security events, you won't necessarily see a profile being removed off the system. So what we want to do is also audit for deletion events. This was kind of a dilemma for IBM. When you delete a profile, do you consider that a security event or a deletion event? And because they're not leveraging the permissions of the profile when they're deleting it, IBM selected the deletion type. So DO events will indicate when a profile is deleted.
So the audit log has a lot of information in it, Robin. So a couple different things that maybe you can expand on that we can do to help users manage and use these audit journal entries to
Absolutely.
figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so and it's not just limited to these two. There's actually hundreds of these entries that are out there, that many of which you should be looking at on an ongoing basis. So the compliance monitor tool that I've already introduced around reporting on profile settings is also able to do forensic analysis of the audit journal entries. And if you've never looked at the audit journal, you'll know that it's probably not a fun place to delve into manually. It's kind of like a flat file. This data is collected, it is retained there until you decide what to do with it. And having Compliance Monitor allows you to make benefit from it. The other option is if you have or interest in or have an existing SIM solution, and I'm talking tools like PowerTech's Event Manager. You may also have ArcSight or Splunk or Logarithm, QRadar, to name just a few. Then we can configure IBMI through our SIM agent to communicate events to those tools in real time. So that's a great way to look for things that are happening maybe in correlation across multiple partitions, or individual events that occur in a balance of maybe hundreds of thousands of normal day-to-day events, so that we can find that proverbial needle in the haystack. So really good things here. The auditing function, I always explain to people, is built into the operating system. You simply have to activate it, and that takes one command. Now, when people do that, they have a tendency to get a little freaked out at the volume of data that can be logged. So that's where the tools can make nice of that by enabling us to have automation around the interrogation and reporting of those entries. The auditing of creation and deletion of profiles is one part of this, but there's also the auditing of the functions performed by users on the server. We have the ability to audit command entries for any user that has the ability to run commands. So my suggestion is to turn that on. Now, bear in mind that most users on an IBMI system have a tendency to be able to run commands. So I typically recommend that there be some cleanup performed first to bring down the number of users that have these privileges before we then audit the ones that remain. You should also consider deploying exit programs that allow us to control the use of commands coming through PC interfaces. So FTP, for example, SQL, remote command itself, all allow users to run commands from a DOS prompt. Right? So it's not just about command line, it should also be handled and managed through the exit points and exit programs as well. If you're not familiar with the concept of an exit point or exit program, don't worry. Just think of it as an extended function beyond what the operating system does by itself. In this instance, what we're wanting it to do is limit the use of the command interfaces to only those users that have a justified need. There's also some APIs in the operating system that allow us to give privileges on an as needed basis. So rather than me having that all object special authority all the time, there may be instances when perhaps I am justified in its assignment, but I can get it when I need it. And there are APIs in the operating system that allow us to leverage that function.
I kind of like the idea of allowing users to have their privileges temporarily elevated. Tell us a little bit more about how Authority Broker can help with that, but also being able to keep track of all those PC connections that users might be using.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Authority Broker is a great tool for allowing a user on the fly to elevate their privileges. And this is something that then facilitates the ability for us as administrators to remove privileges that aren't constantly needed. So as a user, I can then sign into the system, and if there's something that is restricted that I need to be able to do, I can elevate my authority, do the task, and then relinquish those privileges when I'm done. And arguably one of the best features of that is a screen capture function that says while the user is in that elevated mode, we're going to record all of their 5250 activity so that we can see clearly where they went, what they did, and what they looked at. Right? So it's a much easier way, perhaps, than the audit journal to interpret what the user was doing in the system, as well as only assign privileges when they're necessary. The other piece of this is, of course, the exit point manager, which is simply a suite of pre-written exit programs so that you don't have to, again, reinvent the wheel. If you're not sure how to write exit programs, or you don't want to maintain and own that process yourself, then we can provide all of them so that you have a screen-based or an application-based ability to set rules around which users should be able to connect in through those PC-based interfaces, and whether those types of connections are being logged and audited. So really very flexible and powerful way to put a ring of protection around your machine. Now, profiles tend to be very disparate based on the fact that, as I've said before, they're copied or they are propagated from system to system. So one of the things that I suggest to people on an ongoing maintenance basis is that you compare the current settings with the expectation of those settings. This is something that should be done not only at the profile level, but even at the system level. You want your object authorities to be maintained consistently, your system values to be maintained consistently. But being able to identify exceptions is a much simpler way, much less human intensive way of determining that there's a problem, and the system is perfectly capable of using those processes in an automated way. Again, that's really the best thing I would offer here. And the policy manager piece that I introduced a little bit earlier really is the best way, again, to ensure that these configurations stay matching the baseline. By defining how our system should look, running a compliance report behind the scenes, which involves no human interaction, the system can simply come back to us and say, yep, this is wrong, and then I have a decision about what I want to do. Do I want to remediate it myself? Do I want to update the baseline? Perhaps something's changed over time and I have new policy. Or do I want the system to make the correction for me? Now, Sandy, I know that you and I both work with shops a lot, and one of the concerns that I hear a lot revolves around the fact that users tend to create, let's call it, headaches for the IT staff when it comes to connecting to the system. And I'm sure you give similar responses that I do to that, in that everybody thinks they have the worst shop ever, but the reality is we've heard it all, right, many times.
Yep.
The stats out there really hold this in great regard, in that a lot of help desk tickets really do revolve around account issues, be it passwords or disabled profiles. And Forrester has reported that a single password reset can cost upwards of $70 per incident, based on people having to get involved and the business delay while that user is not productive. What we want to make sure is that we're not ever permitting a user to have an endless number of retries allowed in order to reduce the calls for assistance. And I do occasionally hear that, and you probably have too, Sandy. We don't want that limit set at, say, 3, because we know that everybody then will be calling our help desk. What I suggest, though, is that if we're not disabling the account or setting some type of threshold, the risk exposure from a brute force attack is obviously significant. So what we need to be able to do is find a balance between the number of attempts that are allowed and the ability for us to block a brute force attack. Another consideration is not to give security officer privileges to somebody whose responsibility revolves around just simply re-enabling a disabled account or reassigning a password. And unfortunately, IBMI says you have to be a security administrator in order to do that, which is one of the responsibilities or special authorities granted to a security officer. What I'd much rather see is some type of programmatic process that allows either the user to do it themselves, ideally, or the help desk to perform a subset of that reset function. So they can't change any other parameters on the profile except for the enablement status, for one a better example.
So PowerTech Password Self-Help can help with that and take that burden off the help desk.
Yeah, by allowing a user to go out to a URL and provide some answers to a challenge response question. That's definitely a much more productive way of getting the user back online in a timely manner, rather than simply having to involve other skilled resources. So I've tagged this as deprovisioning because, of course, I've given you kind of a directive that I'd rather have users meet end of life at some point. So we need to talk about how that is decided and what happens when that occurs. So the first thing is to really make a decision, define some policy around how you're going to measure when a profile is no longer necessary. For us, we look at kind of best practices and standard operating procedures, somewhere being around 30 to 45 days, is indicative that a profile is probably no longer needed. But I know there are, of course, exceptions to that. So you've got to look at your own business and say, what is reasonable here? Once you've determined what that threshold is going to be, you then have to decide what act you're going to perform. Are you going to simply disable the profile, or are you actually going to remove it? And maybe you have different tiers where after 30 days you disable it and after 90 days you delete it. So it's totally okay to blend those two things together. One caveat is you need to remember that disabled profiles are still able to run jobs. Disabling the profile simply prevents them from making a new connection to the server. Another recommendation I tend to make is that if you have a privileged account, not just a person who works as an admin, then consider taking away the privileges associated with that profile if you're not intending to delete it. What I mean by that is, if you're going to leave that profile out there for 60 days, I don't want it to have the same configuration as if it was perhaps an active profile, because if that profile is compromised, it's going to potentially be able to do things that we otherwise could prevent it from doing. Automation here is very beneficial because, let's face it, we are all busy. The chances of me going out and trying to determine which profiles are no longer needed is not something that I'm going to put near the top of my list.
So seeing a pattern here, we've obviously got tools that have multiple functionality that can help with not just provisioning, but the deprovisioning.
Sure. So when we onboard a new user through Policy Manager, we talked about being able to do that through that central pane of glass. We can also deprovision an account. So there's a piece here that allows us to do that. Now, the Policy Manager that I've identified on the slide really goes to allowing us to define when the profile is to reach end of life, whether it's one phase or multiple phases, and then remediating that. And that could be deleting the profile, it could simply be disabling the profile. If we decide to delete it, we have to make sure that we're reassigning that. And I'll mention kind of how that works in a minute, of reassigning the objects they own. But this is a great way to really identify the profile, establish the policy, and then find out which actual user accounts out there are now in quote unquote violation of that policy by still existing. The second part of that then is, once and if you've decided that there is going to be a decision to actually remove the profile, then of course any objects owned by the user have to be reallocated to somebody else. And that's a task that can be done automatically, but it can only be done singly. And what I mean by that is it's all or nothing. All objects are reassigned to another profile, or you have to do it manually so you can individually choose which objects get owned by whom. My suggestion here is to try to avoid this even being necessary in the first place. One of the worst offenders of this are developers. Because they're creating lots of objects, the ownership of those objects is initially theirs. So one of the things you want to look at as you promote programs or you do your development is to reassign ownership to profiles that have been created purely for the purpose of owning them. Then if you have to remove one of those accounts, the programmer, for example, you don't have 1,000 objects out there that you have no idea what to do with. That's a much cleaner way to be able to remove the profile off. And in fact, that's one of the inhibitors why people tend to leave them on the system. When you're removing profiles, you may want to consider saving that security data to media before you do so. And remember that you need to delete that profile from all LPARs. So if you do have multiple partitions, don't overlook that that user may exist in other places. I mentioned the identity manager here before as well, so this is a good way to automate that function. From my single dashboard, I can now say, hey, Sandy, you were on partition 1, 3, and 5, and I want you to be removed off of all of those, or even perhaps reallocated to a different role in the company, and I want to remove the profile in its current configuration and reestablish it in a different one. And being able to do that centrally, of course, is very beneficial. We want to also check for backdoors when we deprovision an account. One of the things that I've learned over the years is that when you want to get rid of a profile, especially if it pertains to somebody leaving the organization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, you may benefit from checking out any recently created profiles. There have been some known cases, very high profile cases, where people have left an organization. The organization, per policy, removed their account access, but what they didn't realize was that the employee had created an alternate profile from themselves that remained active. So definitely want to be looking for that. Also, job schedule entries should be checked. You should maintain a list of the job schedule entries that have that documented, whether you're using an IBM scheduler, a third-party scheduler like Robot. Make sure you know what's in that schedule so that if there is a new job or a job that is designed to run only if the profile is no longer, or the person is no longer there to move its target date, this is a way that Trojan horses or corrupt code can be introduced. In fact, I had a customer who determined they had a job schedule entry that was kind of set on a timer, and the employee would constantly move it out once a week. They'd move it out to run 2 weeks later, knowing that if they were at some point no longer employed there, that job would run, which is scary stuff. If you have programs that adopt the authority of a powerful profile like all object, check to see that you know what that program does. Same thing with objects that are created in operating system libraries. We can help identify that through some of the reports in Compliance Monitor. The risk assessment down at the bottom here is another option. And really what we're trying to do is just make sure there's nothing being left on the system that is not part of the authorized function. Security assessments should be run on a recurring basis anyway. I know some people don't ever do them, and then some do them but once or maybe once every few years. This is something that you should be doing on an ongoing basis. And so the Help Systems Risk Assessment Service offering here, and Sandy, I know you talk to customers about Security Scan that we're going to mention here in a second, but this is a great way for people to have a good feel for what's going on in your system so that you're comfortable that there's nothing happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, very granular evaluation.
Yep, absolutely. So, solutions are something that we've introduced really by name here, but from my perspective, Help Systems' biggest differentiator is the level of knowledge and expertise within the organization. People like Sandy, Carol Woodbury, Pat Boats. These are backed up by several teams of people that all they do is live, eat, and breathe this conversation, not only on IBMI, but also on other platforms as well. So we try to ensure that we have knowledge transfer and we have people that stay up to date on the operating system. In fact, Help Systems has 3 IBM champions on board, 2 of them in security, myself and Carol, out of a global total of 39 of those on the Power Platform. So we're really well positioned in that regard. The solutions that are out there are designed to address lots of different areas. Of course, user provisioning, deprovisioning, and policy management is just one sector here. Exit programs we've introduced as a concept, and vulnerability assessments as well. But not just for IBMI. Again, this is a statement that exists on other platforms too. Because this is an IBMI webinar, of course, we're focusing on those solutions, and there's a number of different product modules behind the scenes. I'm not going to take the time to go through these now. If you have an interest in talking to us about security, then this is something we'll introduce to you at some point, because we just bring the piece to the table that you're hungry for. Right? So part of that is, of course, determining which piece is necessary. So I'm going to leave you with a call to action here. I called it mine, but Sandy, I think it's probably fair to say that we both make the same recommendation, right? And I know that you are responsible for doing a significant number of these risk exams for the IBMI community, which we all appreciate.
Yes.
So this is a scan function that you can run on your system. It takes less than a minute to run, and then Sandy or I or somebody on our team will spend a better part of an hour with you going through the results, explaining what it means, how you interpret it. And we don't charge for the tool. We don't charge for our time. So this is an absolutely fantastic way for you to validate what you've done and also to understand if there's anything that you missed. And it works both ways. And this is a tangible report that you can print or share and keep for yourself. So take advantage of that if you've never done it before, or if it's been more than a year since you did it previously. Another option that I love to recommend is Carol Woodbury's book. Carol's name I mentioned as part of our services team. She literally wrote the book on IBM security and was actually the architect of IBM security for IBM for many years as well. So this is a great resource, and you can find this on MC Press online or I believe on Amazon. Just make sure you get the copy that has this cover. It's the second edition. It is the most up to date, and it is good clear through version 7.3 of the operating system. And there's not much beyond that you need to know that's not at least addressed in this book. So this is still extremely valuable as a resource. The State of IBM Security study that I mentioned a little bit earlier and we extracted some of our statistics from is available for download. So take advantage of that as well. That's a no cost download, and that'll give you lots of insight into what people are doing and not doing. All right, Sandy, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to take one question here. Jonathan, you asked, is there a way to compare user profiles to see if there are duplicate profiles on the system? Well, there's no easy way necessarily to compare specifically one profile against another to see if it's duplicated, but certainly I can pull up a list of all the profiles and I can filter them in tools, for example, that say, show me anybody who has all object and command line permission. In that way I can do it, but there's no simple way that I can think of that would necessarily do that on a side-by-side basis. We do a lot of that with system values from one system to another, but I can talk about, this user is a programmer and they don't have the attributes associated with programmers. All right, so hopefully that would be helpful, but maybe we can chat a little bit further and we can understand specifically what you're trying to do and see if that would be something we can help with. All right, well, thanks everybody. Definitely appreciate you spending some time with us today. And if you do have any questions as a follow-up to our conversation, feel free to reach out to us, the contact information here, and Sandy or I will be happy to talk to you. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to talking to you again on an upcoming webinar. Thanks, Sandy, for your help here, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks, Robin. Have a good day.